Okay, so we are ready to start. My name is David Levi-Faur. I'm from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Political Science and Public Policy. And I am very, very happy to host here today Professor Yannis Papadopoulos, a great colleague, also a professor of public policy at the Institute of Political Studies of the University of Lausanne. Yannis concentrates in his research on the implication on governance transformation for accountability and democracy. So he stands really and made the important contribution to the relations between public policy and democracy. He recently published a book, Understanding Accountability in Democratic Governance, in the Cambridge Elements in Public Policy. Just come out. It's available online. The cover photo is the background of my photo, and you can approach it later via a link that I will have in the YouTube video in our channel. Please also subscribe to our channel. This is part of a series on talks about regulation, governance, and public policy. I will also mention that Yannis published a lot. He was the research director at the French SNRS, research fellow at St. John College in Oxford. He was visiting professor at EUI, Florence, Jean Monnet Fellow, Sciences Po Paris, École Normale Supérieure, and in various Swiss, French, and Greek universities. So, Yannis, we are very, very happy to have you with us, and we will have the talk as a kind of a conversation where we can, also give opportunity to the audience to take part. So, if you have question, you want to add something, make the things more vivid for you, just throw your questions in the chat. So first question, and after the thank you, Yannis, is what is accountability and why it's important? And I'm asking that is, what is accountability? What is your value added? What you bring above what we know? So what is accountability? Why it's important? And how did you contribute to the concept?
Yes, well, first, thank you very much, David, for your kind words and for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation on my short book that was published indeed a few months ago. So the book is available in open access if you wish to access it. Well, I think it's obvious that accountability is considered important. It appears to be a virtue that is essential to democratic government. It provides legitimacy, which is necessary for good governance. However, I would like to emphasize more the analytical and empirical aspects of accountability. And I think we gain there's a gain for the analysis if we approach accountability with an interactionist perspective. So focusing on the accountability relationship or relationships, there can be more than one. And I think it's fruitful to disaggregate them into 4 steps, which do not all necessarily occur in every single process. The first step is the sequence in which an individual actor or an organized actor, an organization, complies with an obligation to explain and justify their conduct to an audience. This obligation can be formal, but it can also be practical or moral. So it's the reason-giving requirement. And the actor who is accountable provides information about different kinds of things, procedures, performance, outcomes. The audience, who is part of the accountability audience, we also call the audience the accountability forum in the relevant literature. Well, the audience is usually composed of those who have delegated tasks to the accountable actor, so the principals, but it can also include those who are affected by the actors' decisions, This is what we call external accountability or participatory accountability based on affectedness. And it can also include third parties, such as courts or auditing institutions. That's the first step. The second step, like I said, we don't need to have all these sequences, is the phase of debate. A debate may follow reason giving, and the audience can pose questions to the actors that are held accountable and evaluate them. And it's an empirical matter to know whether these questions are to the point, relevant or not, to evaluate the quality of the debate, and so on and so forth. Third sequence, well, based on this evaluation and depending on the evaluation by the audience or the forum, the actor that is accountable may face consequences. And these consequences can be positive. The actor can be rewarded, promoted, re-elected, whatever, or they can be also negative. The actor can lose office, the actor can see the budget of the organization cut down, and so on. And the final step, which is not necessary either, is that, well, the previous, based on the accountability process, the actor's decisions can be corrected, either because this is mandated by a forum, for example, by a court that passes judgment, or it's because it's the actors themselves that become aware of the need to change things through a learning process. So basically, I think it's important to keep this interactionist approach perspective in mind and disentangle the process in a number of phases.
I see, but can you expand on how does it change the way the literature approached accountability so far? Are you suggesting this is the kind of advantages? Which are advantages this interactionist or actor-centered accountability analysis? Usually, it's it's against the functional or the institutionalist approach to accountability.
I wouldn't say that it's incompatible with an institutionalist approach because, for example, the actors are part of institutions, or they can also be interinstitutional accountability. But even if it is interinstitutional accountability, it is still interactionist. I mean, institutions as collective entities have to interact with each other. I think the main advantage is to strip off accountability from its, let's say, normative content, to consider it as something that is inherently positive or valued, and to provide and to have a framework that allows to identify the process step by step. This is not, I would say, completely novel as such. I think the novelty is that it can be applied to many kinds of different accountability relations, and this is what I'm trying to do in my book, approach accountability in different areas, while the literature usually is very much fragmented, compartmented. For example, there are people studying very well electoral accountability, but this is just one facet of accountability process, and we need to consider other facets as well.
I see. Can I ask a personal question? Why did you choose accountability? How did it come to be? Because you could write on many issues.
I don't think I can write on too many issues. I think studying accountability was, if you wish, a follow-up of my work on the relationship between policymaking and democracy. I started investigating the connection by studying participation in policymaking processes. To what extent are they inclusive? Representation. To what extent different kinds of interest are represented, pluralist, and so on and so forth. And then I realized that well, a different angle to approach the democratic quality of policymaking is to study accountability. I mean, you can have policymaking processes that are not participatory at all, not very inclusive, not very pluralist, but you can imagine, you can conceive of the actors participating in these processes to be strongly accountable to a number of audiences. And this, of course, influences the content of policymaking, even though these processes are not directly participatory. So accountability, I found that accountability originally was a sort of blind spot in the study of the connection between democracy and policymaking.
Yeah, I see. So does it mean that you really suggest that competitive elections are not as effective instrument for accountability as democratic theory may assume? Yes. To what extent we need more mechanism of accountability when we have competitive elections?
That's a very good point. Thank you, David. I would respond in two parts. The first part is about what the literature on electoral accountability tells us about its how effective it is. So this is a literature on party politics, on electoral behavior, on voting, retrospective as opposed to prospective vote, and so on and so forth. Well, electoral accountability is not only accountability in general is valued, but I would say that electoral accountability is usually considered to be a core mechanism of democratic accountability. This is what makes accountability democratic in representative government. So it's a major legitimizing device of our democratic systems. Now, if we look first at the empirical evidence on whether elections operate as an effective accountability mechanism, the evidence is mixed. There is no agreement, for instance, on whether voters are sufficiently equipped or even willing to evaluate a government's past performance and as a consequence, to reward them or to sanction them. So the evidence is mixed. The evidence is also inconclusive regarding the impact of the electoral setup on voters' capacity to evaluate governments. For example, their capacity may depend on the composition of the executive. If you have a multi-party executive, this tends to dilute responsibility. The role of divided government, as we have in the US, or also the vertical separation of power in federalist systems. So if we look at elections and what empirical research tells us about the role of elections, it's mixed. Okay. I argue that not only it is empirically mixed, but it's insufficient. It's insufficient because, if you want, what do elections allow to do? They allow to reward or sanction the party or the parties that are in power. But this is, we know from governance studies, but this remains relatively superficial. Its accountability limited to the official office holders, regardless, I would say, of their actual responsibility for policy outcomes. So the study of electoral accountability to me is limited. This is the second part of my response. The study of electoral accountability is limited because it overlooks the role of other key players. We know that they exist in policymaking: bureaucrats, experts, interest representatives, and this requires to open up the black box of policy processes. And these studies of electoral accountability don't do that.
Yeah, and You mentioned two types of accountability, just to make it clear. One is the vertical and one is the horizontal. Can you explain what you mean by that, just to make sure that we follow? And I would say vertical is more the electoral process, right?
You can, I would say the electoral process is part of vertical accountability. Vertical accountability has to do with delegation and, in a sense, if you wish, with hierarchy. Especially in parliamentary systems, we have a delegation chain with many elements, from voters to parliaments, from parliaments to governments, from governments to the administration. So you can say that, I mean, these steps are all steps of the vertical accountability chain. Horizontal accountability is, I would say, accountability, well, horizontal accountability is essentially interinstitutional, and it's about institutional being accountable to each other, with these institutions having roughly equal power and not being in a delegation relationship with each other. Take, for example, bicameralism. If there are two chambers in a political system, well, in a sense, if it's perfect bicameralism, each chamber is accountable to the other one because it has to explain its decisions, to justify its decisions, in order for the decisions to be endorsed, approved by the second chamber. You can also consider that accountability of legislative decision makers to courts is also a form of horizontal accountability, including other kinds of institutions, auditing bodies or ombudspersons and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and if you look historically at the democratic, say European democracies, would you say developments are going in the right direction on the vertical accountability or horizontal accountability? How does it evolve across time and space? Do you have observation on that? Do you deal with this in the book?
No, I don't deal with that in the book, but I wouldn't see any clear trend, apart from the fact that, well, the more governance processes become complex, the more you also have elements of horizontal accountability, actors, decision-making sides being accountable to each other. So the more our political systems become complex, the more horizontal accountability gains in weight. And this is, of course, this can be challenging for vertical accountability because there may be frictions. If a decision maker has to be accountable vertically to their constituencies and horizontally, I don't know, to a court, this can create frictions. Well, the idea is that these two types of accountability serve different purposes. Electoral accountability should secure policy responsiveness to the preferences of the citizenry, whereas so democratic input and control, whereas horizontal accountability has a different function. Its function is to protect rights, prevent abuse of power, even by a democratically legitimate majority. So both aspects of accountability tend to coexist. I wouldn't say that it's very difficult to say if there is an optimal balance. What I would have to say, nevertheless, is that, well, a system cannot qualify as democratic if a vertical accountability to the citizenry is absent or weak, whatever the degree of development of horizontal accountability mechanisms.
So you still give the vertical hierarchical accountability more a stronger role in defining democracy.
In defining democracy, yes, I would, yes. But of course, it is not sufficient, and it can also have perverse effects. Majority tyranny, that's that's the major risk, I would say. And that's why it is important to tame electoral accountability with other horizontal mechanisms of accountability. But like I said, this goes with frictions.
Yeah. So the horizontal part doesn't come strongly into democratic indices, and is more about governance, quality of governance.
It depends it depends very much, David, how you define democracy. If you have, let's say, a rather, how would I call it, populist definition of democracy, populist in a technical term, in a technical meaning of the concept. If you adhere to a populist definition of democracy, then, well, one will privilege the vertical dimension of accountability to the citizenry. If one adheres more to a liberal idea of democracy, whereby democracy requires checks and balances, counterweights, limitations to majority rule, then this person would like to see as many horizontal accountability mechanisms as possible.
Yeah.
That's why, for example, judicialization is very controversial. This is a debate that you're very familiar with. It's very topical in Israel. Well, you have people who consider that empowering the courts is absolutely legitimate and necessary as a means to tame majority power, and others precisely think that, well, they have difficulty with what we call the counter-majoritarian difficulty. And the problem is, what's the tipping point? What's the appropriate balance between them? Yeah. It's an open question, and I think it's a matter of political debate and normative preferences.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We are living in an age of electoral reforms, administrative reform, governance reform. There was a lot of investment in good governance in the last decades. Some of it represent neoliberal ideas about the government, but others are really about the efficiency, effectiveness of governance, and this aspect is even more stronger nowadays than, say, 10 or 20 years ago. So, and how do those kind of reform affect the accountability issues?
Yeah, that's also important. And if we consider that there have been many governance reforms, this also qualifies the focus on narrow electoral accountability, because electoral accountability remains the same, while modes of governance considerably change. Well, there have been many kinds of governance reforms. As you said, some of them inspired by neoliberalism. This is, I don't think this is the most important point, at least as far as accountability is concerned. My evaluation is that the idea is that good governance means more effective governance. It should also mean more accountable governance. Now, these two things are not always easy to conciliate. My evaluation is that what we observed is that, first, political control over the bureaucracy. You have this neo-managerial idea that politicians steer and managers row. Well, I think that there have been many studies on transformations of accountability as a consequence of changes in governance. Well, one finding is that political control over the bureaucracy became more sophisticated with performance indicators and these kind of things. However, it is not without limits, without costs, without collateral effects. Whether more sophisticated forms of accountability have resulted into gains with respect to performance and efficiency, this is not clear at all. This is not clear at all. And after all, I think it's not very surprising, given that, well, all these administrative reforms have been animated by conflicting goals, competing goals, so there are inevitable trade-offs. Among the governance, the reforms in the area of governance, I would like to mention also, the advent, the growth of collaborative forms of governance that increasingly involve non-public actors as well. For example, in the production of public services. This is a clear trend, I think, in most established democracies. Well, first, it raises a number of normative problems with regards to accountability, because if you have these complex networks, you don't know any longer what role elected officials play in such networks. You don't even know, they may not participate. Are they able to hold networks accountable? This is not sure either. Control even by professional politicians becomes more difficult if you have complex processes. If the command lines are blurred, if the operators are dissociated from the hierarchical circuit, so it's frequently a mess. It may bring gains in terms of performance, knowledge pooling, policy acceptance, legitimacy. In terms of accountability, this is not clear at all, because the complex becomes more process, responsibility is diluted, and it's particularly difficult, I would say, for outsiders, for the general public, to have a clear view and to evaluate properly what is happening in such kind of networks. And then there are other kinds of governance changes, as you know. Well, the agency phenomenon and the independent agency phenomenon, this is still something different. This also has implications for accountability, but it's a different topic.
Yeah, I can see that. I want to take you, because of the time issues, to the role of the media as a kind of accountability actor. It's not part of the Constitution. It's on the margin of the democratic theory, but it's in the center of democratic practices, or should be, both for negative aspects and positive aspects. Can you refer to that role?
Yes, yes, I can. I'll try to. Well, as you said, the media are not a formal accountability forum. They are an informal accountability forum. Nevertheless, we know, still powerful and effective. And the official accountability forums need the support of the media to perform the role. For example, parliamentarians are alerted by the media and can pose questions. So the role of the media, first it shows that the different accountability audiences are interdependent. This is important in accountability, the interdependence among the actors that hold to account. Now, we all know, I think, that the media play, they are used as fire alarms. Whether accountability becomes more effective with the whole mediatization of politics, this is again a matter of debate. It's still controversial. On the one hand, governing actors elected officials, but not only elected officials, also increasingly public managers. Well, these actors operate under the shadow of media criticism. And it's absolutely normal that they seek to avoid or to counteract the frequently negative bias in media coverage. And they develop strategies, presentational strategies of self-mediatization. The question is if this works. It's hard to say. Well, news management, because that's what it is about. News management obviously becomes more difficult with a growing role of the social media, simply because unchecked information easily becomes viral. On the other hand, I'm inclined to say that mediatization also faces limitation. You know, there are people saying, John Keane, for example, claims in a great book about democracy that we have reached the stage of monitory democracy, so that governing actors are monitored by many kind of other actors. I'm not so sure about that. My impression is that it's basically front stage politics that lends itself to this media dramaturgy. It is put under the public microscope, but I don't think that mediatization penetrates the whole policy process. And this is not because there are deliberate strategies of concealment, but it's the case because policy issues of low salience, measures that are technical or that lack a broad, tangible impact, they don't score high in terms of newsworthiness. So they are not of interest to the media. So many policy debates take place within relatively narrow circles, expert circles. So in such cases, which I think are quite frequent in policymaking, well, the media do not perform their watchdog role. So on the one hand, they may, for example, exaggerate policy failure because of the negativity bias, which is because of newsworthiness. On the other hand, a number of important things can go under the media radar. So what I think increasingly occurs in our political systems is a sort of decoupling between, on the one hand, the political spectacle, and on the other hand, the reality of policy development. And if there is such a decoupling, this may lead to errors in the attribution of responsibility, because it's only those actors who are most visible to the media and to the public that will be held accountable.
Yeah, I can see your point. So you gave us a wide perspective on the accountability. Did we miss anything in the way the book is organized? I will ask you soon what is not in the book, but maybe you want to check that we have the major issues covered.
Maybe there's just one thing that I would like to add. I learned a lot while writing the book when I studied experimental work in social and in organizational psychology about how individuals feel accountability pressure. And this is something that is still, I would say, ignored in traditional political science. It's something that is now studied by public management research, but it should be studied by political scientists as well. For example, we know a lot, I would say, about how citizens behave when they hold governments accountable. whether they are limited in their evaluations, whether they use shortcuts and heuristics. We know a lot. We don't know much about how politicians feel when they are put under accountability pressure. For example, this kind of research in social psychology tends to suggests that accountability mostly has positive effects on the quality of decision making. This, I think, is interesting because in political science, we tend to think sometimes that accountability leads to conformism, to just only apparently the adequate behavior, but also simulation. Doesn't seem to be the case. Things are less good if people feel under too much pressure, too much accountability pressure. But of course, it's difficult to decide what is the threshold, what is the optimal level and degree of accountability, and individuals may experience this differently. So I think we should draw inspiration from this kind of research to study how politicians think. People working in psychology, it's interesting because they say that people behave as politicians. But we don't know how politicians behave actually when they are accountable, and so I think this is a very stimulating path for future research. Keeping in mind, of course, that it's not easy to infer from findings at the individual level behavior and attitudes and motivations at the organizational level. This is something we have to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So what's not in the book? What did you leave apart? You had to be short, and it was writing is a demanding process. What did you left?
Yes, you're right. I had to leave a number of things with regrets. Regretfully, a number of things I had to leave them aside. Well, first, like I said in the beginning, there is certainly a lot to say about actors that may have a key role in the policymaking process, but who nevertheless are not democratically accountable. To whom are experts accountable, and how? Are interest representatives accountable to the rank and file, to their constituencies, to donors in the case of non-governmental organizations? This is, I think, a complicated issue that I didn't have. I didn't have enough space in the book to deal with it. This is the first thing. The second thing is that the book is very much about accountability within the national democratic state. That means that I did not study how accountability works beyond the nation state. Take the case in Europe of the European Union, which is a complex system and very challenging for the study of accountability. Take the case of governance at the global level, including informal entities such as the G20, or private governance actors and regulators. So this is something that I had to leave aside as well. And since it's a book about accountability in democratic systems, the book doesn't say almost anything about accountability within autocratic systems, because it would be wrong to think that accountability only exists, that it would be wrong to think that autocrats are not accountable. They are differently accountable, but are accountable as well. And last thing that I think is missing, but this is a broader debate, is that we talk a lot about the accountability of rule makers. What about and that's more a normative debate. And what about the accountability of citizens? Should citizens be accountable for their choices when they vote in elections, when they vote, even more so perhaps if they vote in referenda? should citizens be public-minded, other-regarding, and be accountable for their choices? And how? What are the correct incentives for that purpose? We have vote secrecy, for example. Should we unveil the vote to have more accountable citizens? So that's a normative debate that I didn't address.
Yeah, thank you for this. I promise now last question, and maybe you can answer. It's a surprise question. Maybe you don't want to answer it. It's fine. So after this talk, which book, in addition to yours, should you recommend to read? Following what you did now, which one I should read?
I would recommend reading, not necessarily a book, but it can be articles, Mark Bovens's work on accountability, because this is, I would say, the theoretical framework on accountability that is now well established, and I think most authors start with this kind of theoretical framework. Yes, Mark Bovens, I would say.
Thank you very much for this. And questions from the audience. We have one from Tsofnat Peleg-Baker. Tsofnat, please come in.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for the insightful presentation so far. I am a social psychologist, and you started touching on the complexity between, and I have the question I wrote, and I can elaborate, is how do you see the link between liberal democracy, interdependence that actually indicates our reliance on others, and being accountable to each other in this kind of a system, and individual accountability, because we want to motivate people to engage and do things together in organizations, and at the same time we need to give them individual incentive, as is acceptable in Western individualist cultures that we operate in. So we always get to this question: how do we compensate or motivate individuals, and at the same time we want them to engage with one another and share the burden and the tasks? So this is something that I am very much engaged in my work.
Thanks very much for the question. Should I respond now, or should I take any other questions?
Yeah, please go on, but please go on.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good.
Yannis, please go on.
A difficult one. Well, first, our mutual interdependence and individual accountability. Well, accountability is, in my view at least, naturally interactionist, and when actors are engaged in accountability relationships, they become interdependent. So I don't see accountability being merely individual, apart from the situation I'm going to refer to it immediately, in which one can imagine of oneself being accountable to oneself. Okay, so the first part of my answer is that, yeah, essentially accountability is about is relational and about actors being interdependent. Now, in the design of liberal democracies, there can be different options, decisions that can be made regarding the kind of interdependence that is valued or privileged. To take this easy distinction between vertical and horizontal accountability, what is going to matter most? Is it having a tight coupling of of rule makers to their electoral constituencies, or is it having different institutions conversing with each other and accountable to each other? This is a matter of political choice. The last point I'd like to make, but I don't know if I'm answering your question, above all because I am not a psychologist, is that an actor may adopt, let's say, prescribed behavior under the pressure of accountability, and especially under the threat of sanctions, of externally imposed sanctions. Now we can also imagine that actors internalize constraints and norms. Actors behave in a proper way because they have been socialized to a number of norms. For example, professional norms. As professionals, we don't need necessarily to provide accounts to our peer continuously. We have internalized a number of norms that make us, for example, adopt ethical behavior in our research. So to me, and this is something that, I didn't talk much about that, and it's not very present in the book either, I have to say. The role of norms that are internalized by actors is important. The question, of course, is if norms suffice. This is an empirical question, but I would say that, in cases in which norms don't serve the function they are expected to serve, it's useful to have a more formal and institutional accountability safeguards.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sofna, do you want to react shortly, or it's fine?
It is complex. It is complex to hold both of them and to motivate people to participate, to make systems less hierarchical, because we are used to get incentives and to get the glory of our successes. So we don't want to share it with other people. On the other hand, we do want people to interact with one another. So this is something that I have to find solutions in my work as to how to hold both of them at the same time, still, motivate people, and also give them, the evaluation, because we are in a very punitive system. The inclination is to go to, if someone fails, we don't use restorative solutions or systems. Usually, I'm trying to use it, but usually I am in hierarchical system, and it is always a challenge. That's what I find.
Thank you very much, Sofnat. Yannis, or shall we go to Nir and then to Michael Strang?
Sure, yeah.
So Nir, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very interesting and eye-opening. Recently, there has been trends of autocratization and democratic backsliding. It happens in many countries and in many forms. Does it have anything to do with accountability, to your understanding? Can the existence of new and more actors in governance and more accountability relationships paradoxically harm democracy, or accountability can prevent such processes? What is your take on it?
Thank you. Please.
Shall I try to answer this question?
Yes, please.
So I didn't hear very well, but basically your question is about backsliding and accountability, right? Yeah. Well, Backsliding to me is I would interpret it as a sort of regression or reduction towards a populist conception of democracy, because democratic backsliding does not necessarily lead to a non-democratic regime. There's still usually electoral competition, for example, but it leads to an excess in power concentration. And with regards to accountability, I would say that the consequence is that in countries that experience these forms of backsliding, accountability is confined to, I would say, the strict vertical electoral dimension. They are hyper-majoritarian politics, whereas all other forms of accountability tend to be considered as illegitimate or less legitimate. Take, for example, accountability of the government to courts, accountability to independent media. This is considered either as unnecessary or illegitimate. So in terms of, it's an under-complex conception of accountability that is at work there.
Thank you. And the last question for Michael. Michael, please.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this discussion. I'm a great fan of your work, Professor Papadopoulos, and I've used it. Also, I mean, you're talking about your focus more on the nation state. I've applied it in looking at the World Trade Organization some time ago. But I'm thinking, of course, we live in an age where a lot of public policy has moved over towards sort of the role of the private sector. A lot of what was public sector, a lot of production of public services is now in the private sector. So how, within your model, should we think through the impact of economic structures on accountability relations? Where would that sit, particularly, in terms of the way those relations structure? I mean, of course, which actors are involved, but also how do you identify who is responsible for a decision? I mean, we have this now with AI, which is something I'm looking at, and it gets you talk about complexity, and it gets even more. Yeah, it's just your thoughts on where do we bring in questions of ownership, economic structures within your model.
Yes, that's a very good point, and it's a tricky normative issue indeed as well. Part of the increasing complexity of decision-making systems resides in the inclusion, the formal inclusion or the role of non-public actors in policy making, including for-profit actors. So what about the accountability of these kind of actors? Well, first, it's an empirical matter, whether they are accountable to, I don't know, if it's a firm, to shareholders, if the firm is concerned about their brand to consumers. But what I would like to say is that, yes, relations become complex and accountability becomes more complex as well. For example, I think it's easy to understand that these kind of actors do not necessarily have the same interests, preferences, or values than public actors. How can they match with the values of the political system? This is not obvious at all. They also, and this is also quite normal, I was referring to norms before, they also have different norms. And what we observe when studying these kind of processes where for-profit actors are involved as well is that actors are confronted with many normative frames, many different perceptions of what kind of accountability relations should prevail. So there is a coordination problem. There's also a problem of actors having to decide which frame to prioritize. So the actors face competing expectations. This is something, for example, that we studied when we studied the processes of service delivery, where services are provided by private actors. Well, it's very difficult to make these private actors politically accountable because this is not their major concern. And it's not only that it's not a major concern, it's that they have other expectations and demands that they have to meet in order to preserve their legitimacy. And this creates a clash, a conflict of accountability, of expectations and legitimacy, which is difficult to handle, indeed.
Yeah. Thank you very much, all. Thank you very much, Yannis, for presenting the book and kind of putting the emphasis on accountability, vertical, horizontal, experimental studies, institutional studies, your actor-centered approach. Thank you very much. See you all in the next seminar.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for questions.
Thank you. Yannis, thank you for this. I think it was good. Did you feel good with this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I felt good. I don't know how the audience felt, but I felt good. Thanks a lot again for giving me the opportunity.
No, my pleasure. And thank you very much for cooperating and, being such a good colleague. I had problem with the recording. Maybe your recording is better. Perhaps you can send it to me.
Yeah, I will check my recording and we'll try to send it to you.
Excellent.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much. And
thanks a lot, David. We'll be in touch. Yeah, our pleasure was mine.